In the spring of 1871, in a town so small it barely appeared on a map of Missouri, a single grave opened the door to one of the darkest chapters in American folklore. The story was whispered, denied in public, and yet carried in the bloodlines of the people who lived there. It began with one girl, the youngest of 7 sisters in a farming family whose prosperity had long since curdled into bitterness. By the time the last stone was set in the churchyard soil, 7 daughters had vanished into the ground. 7 coffins, 7 whispered funerals, and a single question that still lingers more than 150 years later. What does it mean for an entire town to believe its daughters were born cursed? This is not a tale of ghosts rattling chains in the night. It's not the fevered imagination of a novelist inventing horrors to thrill readers by candlelight. This story is rooted in documented accounts from county ledgers, private journals, and funerary records that still exist in archives. What happened to the 7 sisters of Hollow Creek became a case study in superstition, psychology, community violence, and the unsettling possibility that people will build myths around their own crimes to ease their collective guilt. Before we unearth the graves of Hollow Creek and examine the terror that seeped into this rural community, a quick note to you, our audience of seekers, skeptics, and dark historians. If the buried secrets of America's past fascinate you, if stories of overlooked tragedies shake something inside you, or if you simply enjoy peeling back the layers of mystery that polite history prefers to ignore, then join us. Subscribe, so you'll never miss another journey into the archives of hidden horrors. Share this with someone who thinks they can stomach the truth history tried to bury. And remember, the further we dig, the less certain we'll be about who was really the victim and who was the executioner. Hollow Creek, Missouri, was the kind of place the railroads ignored and the newspapers rarely mentioned. In 1870, it was not more than 24 farmsteads scattered across low, wooded hills and muddy creeks that swelled in the spring and froze stiff in the winter. The people who lived there were German and English settlers, descendants of those who had pushed west after the War of 1812, carrying their hymns, their superstitions, and their stubborn belief that hardship was the natural order of life. The Civil War had split Missouri into shadows that lingered long after the shooting stopped. Old men in Hollow Creek wore Union blue caps over work-scarred faces, while others still kept their Confederate jackets hidden in cedar chests. Families did not forget who fought for which side and who buried sons under which flag. Every town in Missouri was caught in that fracture, and Hollow Creek was no different. What made the town distinctive, however, was not politics, but its particular relationship with daughters. In a community driven by survival, women inherited a burden they rarely escaped. Sons could take up arms, break the soil, and join hunting parties. Daughters were meant to anchor the home, tend the gardens, and most importantly, carry family names forward through arranged marriages. In Hollow Creek, a daughter was often not seen as a blessing but a liability. She was a mouth to feed until she became a dowry to spend. And worse, in years when the crops rotted from too much rain or withered under the Missouri sun, any misfortune could be explained away with a superstition so old that no one remembered who first whispered it. A house of daughters draws the devil's eye. It was an old European phrase, passed from immigrant tongues into the marrow of local belief. A family with too many girls, the superstition claimed, was inviting bad luck. Withering crops, sudden sickness, fires, and unexplainable deaths. Daughters, in too many numbers, unbalanced the household and cursed the soil itself. While in other towns the words might remain little more than bitter jokes muttered in saloons, in Hollow Creek they held the weight of scripture. No family bore this burden more heavily than the Whitlock family. Samuel and Margaret Whitlock had settled their homestead 2 miles south of the churchyard, on land choked by oak and sumac. Samuel was a man hardened by war. He had served as a militiaman, always half angry, half scarred by loss. Margaret was a quiet woman, raised on scriptures and old lullabies from her German mother. They were both young when they married, and perhaps too poor to be choosers of fate. Over the years, against their own hopes, their home filled not with sons, but with girl after girl after girl. By 1870, the Whitlocks had brought 7 daughters into the world: Eliza, Catherine, Mary, Ruth, Susanna, Deborah, and Hannah. The youngest, barely 10. 7 daughters in one house. 7 voices at supper. 7 pairs of hands, sewing, washing, cooking, bowing their heads at Sunday service. Their names appeared in the family Bible, penned in careful ink, one beneath the other like steps downward into the earth. It should have been a joy, and in another town perhaps it would have been. But in Hollow Creek, it was a curse waiting to ripen. Neighbors noticed the thickness of the forest around the Whitlock farm. They noticed how the rain seemed to wash gullies into their fields but left others untouched. They noticed Samuel's temper and Margaret's solemn face. And most of all, they noticed the laughing chorus of girls who walked in a line across the valley to church every Sabbath. Too many daughters, the whispers said. Too many voices in one home. Too many feet to draw the devil's eye. The surrounding. Counties might have dismissed such chatter as rural ignorance, but Hollow Creek was a place where every misfortune needed a source to blame. If your chicken sickened, it wasn't the flu, it was the Whitlock daughters. If your cow gave sour milk, it wasn't bad feed, it was the Whitlock curse. If your child stumbled in the creek, it wasn't accident, it was the shadow of 2. Many sisters in one house. The irony was cruel. The Whitlock girls, by all accounts, were gentle and skilled. Eliza, the eldest, was 16 by the spring of 1871. She sewed with such precision that local families paid her to stitch sheets, dresses, and even hymn book covers. Catherine played the pump organ at church when the minister's hands grew stiff with age. Mary was said to be the prettiest, though vanity was quickly beaten down in her home. The younger girls tended animals, gathered herbs, and sang at the table in the evenings, and yet no kindness or skill could drown the whispers. 7 sisters, 7 graves, muttered a farmer one night at the tavern. He claimed it was a phrase his grandmother had used in Saxony centuries before. Too many girls, and the ground itself will claim them back. Soon the phrase passed, from one neighbor to the next, until it carried the weight of prophecy. By spring, men muttered it over their mugs. Women repeated it in gossip, and even children turned it into a cruel rhyme. The town's minister, Reverend Blackwell, did nothing to calm the fear. A stern man, still dressed in black long after the war, Blackwell believed hardship was punishment for sin. From his pulpit, he often thundered warnings from the Old Testament. Lot's cursed daughters, Jezebel's downfall, Delilah's deception. Daughters, he reminded his congregation, led men astray, and when they multiplied in a single household, wasn't that more temptation than heaven ever intended? His sermons etched suspicion into certainty. The Whitlock girls were not simply unfortunate, they were warnings. Each Sunday, as the sisters knelt together in the front pew, the congregation's eyes leaned toward them, as if waiting for Satan himself to tip his hat in acknowledgement. The town of Hollow Creek in 1871 believed in 3 things: work, scripture, and curses. When the whispers about the Whitlock girls began to take shape, the soil was already fertile for paranoia. And what begins with gossip rarely ends with kindness. By midsummer, the town's attitude toward the Whitlocks shifted from watchful suspicion to simmering hostility. Samuel found buyers refusing his corn at fair prices. Margaret noticed women withdrawing from market tables when her daughters approached. Even the minister's wife pulled her shawl closer when the Whitlock girls passed by. And when rumors spread of a stillbirth in a nearby family, there was no question whom people quietly blamed. The Whitlock daughters were quiet, polite, and devout, but in the eyes of Hollow Creek, they were already guilty of something unspeakable. All it would take was one death, one tragedy, to turn superstition into violence, and that tragedy came before the leaves turned that fall. The story of the Whitlock sisters might have remained no more than a cruel rhyme whispered in taverns, had it not been for the summer of 1871, when the first grave was dug. Until then, superstition was smoke, thick, choking, but weightless. It was Eliza, the eldest, who gave the whispers flesh. 16 years old, Eliza Whitlock was everything a mother could prize in a daughter. She was tall, with dark hair that curled despite her efforts to tame it, and hands that were never idle. During sowing season, she worked the fields by her father's side, moving with quiet determination. During harvest, she preserved roots and seeds with her mother. And during the long winter months, she stitched everything from trousers to hymn book covers, earning small coins the family desperately needed. If anyone could have dispelled Hollow Creek's suspicion, it should have been Eliza, dutiful, devout, and wholly unremarkable in her conduct. But suspicion breeds blindness. And when a storm rolled through the valley one humid evening in July, the town's simmering ill will found its victim. That night, thunder cracked across Hollow Creek with the rifle sharpness left over from war. Rain battered the barns and flooded the clay roads. Samuel Whitlock was in the fields, clearing a drainage trench with his eldest, Eliza, at his side. Margaret had begged her husband to wait until morning, but Samuel was not a man who waited on nature. With the lantern swinging and the spade cutting into mud, they worked until the storm broke fiercely overhead. What happened next was never seen by any eyes but Samuel's, and he carried the memory like a nail driven into wood. According to his later statement, lightning struck the ground just beyond the row they were clearing. The blast threw Samuel to his knees, searing the hairs from his arm. Eliza, he said, did not cry out. She collapsed instantly, as if the light itself had reached inside her heart and clenched it stiff. When Samuel rolled her over, her dress wet and blackened, her eyes had already gone glassy and unfocused. She was gone within seconds. The funeral service was held quickly, as the summer heat would not tolerate delay. Reverend Blackwell's voice rang solemn through the rafters of the church as Eliza's coffin, plain pine, draped in a linen shroud stitched by her own hands, was lowered into Hollow Creek's red earth. Margaret wept silently, her face buried in her shawl. The other 6 daughters clutched one another's hands. And Samuel, though outwardly stoic, looked years older than he had only days before. But it was not grief alone that rattled through Hollow Creek. It was vindication. To the townspeople, Eliza's death was confirmation that the Whitlocks carried a curse. Lightning did not strike without meaning, so they reasoned. And the fact that its victim was the eldest of the 7 daughters gave the death the weight of prophecy fulfilled. 7 sisters, 7 graves. The whispers now hissed as if scripture itself had demanded it. 1 taken, 6 left. Practical men could have dismissed it as chance. Lightning strikes are cruel, but not miraculous. Yet superstition never stands still. Once it has tasted blood, it grows. And in Eliza's death, Hollow Creek found precisely the omen it had been waiting for. The younger girls were not shielded from this change. At market, women were colder now, hands tightening on produce when Mary or Ruth passed by. Catherine, who once played the pump organ in church, was quietly told her services would no longer be needed. The laughter of the girls, those cheerful hymns at supper, fell into silence after Eliza's burial. In their home, grief hung like fog between the beams. Their mother stopped humming over her work. Their father buried himself in the fields, sweat mixing with soil until his body ached. Yet grief alone was not the enemy. It was suspicion, sharpened into something darker with every retelling of the storm. Stories peeled away from Samuel's account like bark stripped from an elm. Some said they saw strange blue fire flickering in the Whitlock fields before Eliza fell. Others said she had been laughing in the rain, daring the lightning to touch her. Still others whispered that she had spoken of leaving Hollow Creek altogether. The devil never lets daughters escape, they said, so judgment came first. The cruelty was not limited to invisible whispers. On the morning after Eliza's burial, the Whitlock family found a crude carving burned into their barn door, 7 stick figures, and beside one, a cross slashed deep into the wood. Samuel blamed mischief, some local boys emboldened by drink. But Margaret knew the meaning. 7 sisters, 1 gone, 6 marked to follow. Inside their home, little Hannah asked in a trembling voice if she would be next. Her mother held her and said no, but the question had weight. It had been asked aloud now, and in the stillness of that farmhouse, even Margaret could not be sure of the truth. Eliza's death brought no comfort, no unity, only fracture. Where other farming families might have rallied round, bringing food or aid, the Whitlocks found their circle narrowing. Neighbors kept to their distance. Children pulled at their mothers' skirts when the Whitlock girls approached. At night, the Whitlocks heard riders on the road, voices calling, half laughing, half threatening. 7 sisters, 7 graves. Lightning, grief, and cruelty had joined together, and the first grave of 7 was opened. If Eliza's death was chance, then chance is cruel. But in Hollow Creek, chance carried the weight of prophecy, and prophecy is more dangerous than any storm. And so, when the second sister fell, months later, the town did not question. It only nodded grimly, as though the earth itself had kept its word. By the time autumn's frost clung to the valley and the cornstalks bowed like mourners in a field, whispers had calcified into certainty. Eliza's grave was still fresh, raw dirt pressed too tightly for grass to grow, and yet Hollow Creek was already preparing for the next stone. It did not take long. Catherine Whitlock, the second eldest at 15, had always been the most visible of the sisters. She played the pump organ at the white-painted church, her long fingers striking notes with measure that belied her youth. She could be found reading old hymnals in the porch light at night, singing softly in a high voice that carried like a dove through the rafters. If Eliza had been the Whitlocks' workhorse, Catherine was their song. And song, the town began to whisper, was precisely what tempted devils. After Eliza's funeral, Reverend Blackwell quietly but firmly told Catherine her presence at the organ was no longer necessary. He couched it as kindness, claiming he wanted the girl to have time to grieve. But Catherine, sharp as her father and honest as her mother, knew the unspoken truth. The congregation did not want Whitlock hands near their worship. Even sacred music was not pure enough to survive the stain of a cursed family. Not long after this dismissal, Catherine's light began to dim. She still sang, but quietly now. Only. In the kitchen, only when she thought no one else was awake. She refused to go to market, fearing the stares. She took to walking alone along Hollow Creek in the gloaming, where the woods pressed tight and the water ran shallow but quick. Samuel scolded her for wandering. Margaret scolded her for silence, but Catherine said only that she needed space. And space became distance, and distance became danger. The story of Catherine's death was told and retold until no one remembered what was real and what was rumor. What is documented, however, is that on an October evening, as leaves crackled red and yellow beneath bare trees, Catherine did not return from her walk. The Whitlock household erupted in panic. Samuel roused neighbors despite their sullenness, and men with lanterns spread through woods and water. Margaret and the younger girls lit candles and left them in the windows, praying the glow might guide her home. It was not until dawn that a shouted voice dragged Margaret to the creekside. Catherine was found face down in shallow water, her hair splayed like black moss over the current. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no broken limbs, no torn dress. It looked almost peaceful, as though she had chosen to lie down in the current and let the world's weight sink her. Dr. Wren, the county coroner called from a town 2 miles over, recorded drowning as the cause. Though even he admitted the water was barely deep enough to cover her mouth and nose. An accident, he wrote, perhaps fainting, perhaps a bad step. But an accident was not what Hollow Creek wanted. Lightning for the first, water for the second, they whispered in pews and at tavern tables. The 7 will fall, each in their turn, until the earth is satisfied. Even the details warped in telling. Some claimed Catherine's body was ringed by snakes when found, though no such account stands in the coroner's notes. Others swore her hands were folded, as if she were already in prayer when the water took her. Still others claimed Margaret had confessed her daughter saw visions of fire and water before her death, a rumor Margaret denied until her dying breath. The truth hardly mattered. In the eyes of Hollow Creek, Catherine's death was not tragedy. It was prophecy sharpening its blade. At her funeral, the air was colder, the congregation's whispers louder. 2 sisters in 2 seasons, 2 graves in as many months. The rhyme now felt less like cruel fun and more like law. 7 sisters, 7 graves. The children chanted in yards when the Whitlock girls passed. The adults did not stop them, nor did Reverend Blackwell rebuke his people. In silence, with every bowed head, guilt turned into dark faith. For the Whitlocks, grief congealed into terror. Margaret's body bent under sorrow, her shoulders narrowing, her cheeks thinning. She rarely left the house, passing from bed to stove with the slow carriage of a woman decades older. Samuel carried grief differently, loudly, in bursts of anger, slamming doors, spitting at neighbors, muttering invectives as though half the county were conspiring against him. And the sisters, now just 5, learned to move like shadows, eyes down, heads lowered, lips pressed silent at market and at church. And yet, even in their withdrawal, they felt hunted. Strange things began happening at the edge of their land. A slaughtered goat left at the fence post with its throat cut too clean for wolves. Hickory branches stacked into a crude figure, 7 sticks standing upright, one knocked flat across the others. Fires lit on their boundaries at night, unseen hands moving just out of lamplight. The youngest sister, Hannah, swore she heard voices, chanting outside her window, 7 sisters, 7 graves. Samuel dismissed it as childish nerves. But even he kept a shotgun propped against the kitchen door after sundown. Among the townspeople, the deaths of Eliza and Catherine were discussed not with shock, but with inevitability. "The curse takes them one by one," muttered old men at the tavern. "Better it takes them quick before more misfortune spreads." Some even began speaking of the Whitlocks in terms of contagion. To touch one was to invite disaster. To befriend one was to share in their fate. Even courtship soured. Where once young men had eyed Mary, the 3rd eldest, with interest, now they gave her only guarded distance. Who would marry a cursed lineage? Who would welcome such daughters into their homes? It was not only the Whitlock family under siege. Any misfortune in Hollow Creek now widened the noose. A boy crushed beneath a falling wagon, a hog disease spreading, through a farmer's pen, a fire in the mill that winter, all blamed in some twisted way on the sisters who remained. "It draws from them, through them," whispered Reverend Blackwell's parish. "Their lives are payment for our suffering." The Whitlocks were not cursed by heaven or earth. They were cursed by their own neighbors. And with 2 daughters already buried, the tally had begun. And the town would not be satisfied until prophecy had made the count complete. In November, Margaret told Samuel she had dreamed Eliza and Catherine standing at the foot of her bed, their hair wet, their faces pale, silently beckoning for the others. Samuel told her it was grief. But when Margaret's voice cracked, he did not argue further. Even inside their own house, the rhyme would not be silenced. 2 down, 5 remaining. The Whitlocks prayed harder, worked harder, drew tighter. But as the year turned and the air sharpened to January frost, the town of Hollow Creek already expected the next grave. The question was never if. The question was only when. If Eliza's death had been storm and fire, and Catherine's had been water and silence, Mary Whitlock's death was spectacle, an event that transformed whispered superstition into roaring certainty. At 14, Mary was the sister on whom neighbors had once placed their cautious hopes. Where Eliza had been dutiful and Catherine had been pious, Mary was light. Even in Hollow Creek's unforgiving soil, Mary had a spirit that reached stubbornly for the sun. Her flaxen hair and pale eyes made her stand out in church pews, and her nature invited comparison to scriptural maidens. Gentle Ruth, patient Esther. For a time, neighbors said she might escape the curse by marriage, lifted out of Hollow Creek to another valley, another fate. But as soon as Eliza was lowered into the ground, those hopes turned to suspicion. "Beauty makes it worse," muttered an older farmer's wife. Too much brightness in a cursed house was itself suspicious. When Catherine followed Eliza into the earth, Mary's beauty shifted from promise to omen. She became a flower that should not have bloomed in cursed soil, and the town waited to see how poisonous her petals might prove. Her death came in February of 1872, on a day meant for celebration. The Whitlocks had been invited, almost reluctantly, into town for the wedding of a neighboring family's eldest son. Some said the invitation was extended out of pity, others claimed it was guilt, and some whispered it was simply practicality. Too many empty chairs looked poorly at a feast. For the Whitlocks, the ceremony was both relief and strain. Samuel, insisted they attend, believing absence would feed gossip further. Margaret hesitated but obeyed. And so Mary, in her simple pale dress, tied her shawl against the cold and walked into the churchyard where she herself would never walk out alive. Accounts differ on the details, but all agree the church was crowded tightly, its air heavy with the mingling of wood smoke and hymn. The Whitlocks kept to themselves in the back pew, eyes lowered, heads bowed during blessings. Mary sat between her younger sisters, her pale hair catching the light of the lanterns. A witness later swore that people kept glancing, not at the bride, not at the groom, but at Mary, as if the cursed child herself overshadowed the vows. One whispered, "If death is to take one, it will take her." During the reception at the mill house, after the vows, the Whitlocks stood awkwardly at the edges of the room. Margaret shepherded the younger girls, pulling them close when townsfolk stared too long. Samuel drank, muttered, glowered, and Mary, curious, restless Mary, moved among the crowd, speaking shyly to girls her own age, tasting bread, smiling when no one was watching. Then came the fire. It started in the mill's upper loft where candles had been wedged into beams for light. Perhaps a spark caught on straw, or wax dripped onto dry timber. No one noticed at first. The fiddler played loud, boots struck the wood in rhythm, voices layered on laughter and song. But Mary noticed. She had always been quick-eyed, quicker-hearted. She pointed upward, her voice lifting above the fiddle. "There's fire." Panic unfolded in an instant. Flames licked downward with ravenous speed, feeding off the dust of meal and grain. Screams drowned out music as families tugged children toward narrow doors. Samuel was already forcing Margaret outside, dragging young Hannah and Susanna by their wrists. In the chaos, Mary tried to follow, but the crowd pressed backward, collapsing against itself like a tide. Later, survivors swore she could have escaped. They said she seemed to pause, turning back toward the loft stairwell, where children were trapped by the spreading fire. They said she shouted, "This way," guiding two smaller ones to the door. Whether out of instinct, kindness, or simple Whitlock stubbornness, Mary did not push herself forward, but turned again, seeking one more child, one more hand to pull through smoke. The beam fell before she could reach the doorway, when the building collapsed, its roof crashing inward with a scream of timber. Mary vanished into the fire. Her body was not removed until days later, when charred beams cooled enough to shift. Identified only by a remnant of her shawl clasp and her father's broken recognition, she was buried in ashes and silence. The fire claimed multiple lives, including 3 children and an elderly man. But Hollow Creek remembered only one name. For every death, Mary was blamed. "It follows her, it follows them," muttered survivors. Where Whitlock daughters go, flames rise. Though she'd been seen helping others, though she had shouted warnings, even saving lives, those facts dissolved in the fire's glow. All that remained was the image of fire consuming the third sister. And now the town's tally became an iron calculation. 3 gone, 4 remain. At Mary's funeral, Margaret collapsed against the pew. Samuel stood with his fist clenched white. On the coffin edge, his rage held in visible check. The younger sisters clung mute to one another. The congregation pretended pity, but their eyes flashed something colder, like a ledger being balanced, prophecy unfolding neatly into shape. For some, this was cause for dread, for others, a grim satisfaction. 7 sisters, 7 graves, children whispered yet again. It was no longer rhyme, nor even warning. It was ritual. Mary's death broke Margaret in places she could not repair. Her voice, once low but steady, grew thin, unmoored. She wandered the farmhouse muttering prayers, pressing crucifixes into her daughter's hands as though wood could shield flesh. Samuel, alternately violent and numb, threatened to leave Hollow Creek entirely, but the land pinned him there. Debts chained him to soil that no one else would buy. The remaining daughters, Ruth, Susanna, Deborah, and Hannah, watched the curse unfold with eyes too old for their years. They did not sing anymore. They ate in silence. They knelt in silence. They begged heaven not for marriages, or good harvests, or summer's relief, but for survival another day, another hour. And still, the town whispered. Still riders passed their farm gate at night, leaving tokens. 7 stones stacked and toppled, 7 scratches carved in bark, a doll left hanging by its neck on the fence. The rhyme was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to Hollow Creek, Eliza. Catherine, Mary, 3 graves filled, 4 graves yet waited. By the spring of 1872, Hollow Creek had stopped asking whether another Whitlock sister would die. They only asked which one and when. The Whitlock farmhouse stood heavy with silence. 4 daughters remained now: Ruth, Susanna, Deborah, and little Hannah. They moved like shadows through the house, through the fields, burdened not only with grief but with the gaze of a town that believed their every breath was borrowed time. A neighbor once wrote in a letter, "It was as though those children already walked with one foot in the grave. The town saw them less as girls than as omens." Ruth, the 4th sister, was 13. Where her elder sisters had carried beauty, caution, or faith, Ruth carried defiance. She alone refused to bow her head in church, raising her chin even when whispers hissed. She continued walking to market, glaring at women who drew their skirts aside. She told Hannah more than once that she would live long enough to spite them all. Susanna, at 12, was Ruth's opposite. Quiet, plain, with large dark eyes that seemed always to be waiting for something to happen. If Ruth was spark, Susanna was shadow, observant, restrained, uneasily calm. Margaret often worried aloud, "That one thinks too deeply," as though thinking itself were dangerous in Hollow Creek. In April, the family tried futilely to resume some rhythm. Samuel threw himself into planting, his hands blistering at the plow. Margaret focused on the kitchen, on tasks small enough to be controlled. The girls mended aprons, tended goats, sewed new hymn covers. Life creaked onward. But beneath every action was the steady drumbeat. 3 gone. 4 remain. 1 more year, perhaps less, and prophecy would march again. And it did. Ruth was found first. On a cloudless afternoon in late May, she disappeared while gathering herbs beyond the pasture. The family called for her at dusk. Only silence replied. Lanterns scanned the edge of the woods. Margaret's voice cracked into frenzy. Hannah sobbed. Samuel barked angry orders at the shadows. The search stretched through the night, neighbors begrudgingly following with lanterns, though some muttered that it was wasted effort. Dawn revealed her. Ruth's body was discovered in the clearing near Devil's Hollow, a ravine long whispered of in children's tales. She lay at the base of jagged rocks, one leg bent unnaturally, her face pale beneath tangled hair. The coroner ruled that she had slipped and fallen. Samuel swore the ground bore no sign of misstep. Some neighbors whispered worse, that Ruth had jumped, defiant to the end, unwilling to wait for the curse to claim her. Whatever the truth, Ruth was stone dead. The 4th sister, buried beside her 3 elders, beneath a pine marker carved with clumsy hands. The funeral, by then, was rote. Hollow Creek turned out not to comfort the Whitlocks, but to comfort themselves. Each death, paradoxically, reassured them. The prophecy was working. The curse was unfolding. And if those girls fell fast enough, perhaps the rest of the town would be spared. Samuel's fists shook at the service. Margaret's voice was gone, but it was Deborah and Hannah who clung hardest to Susanna, their eyes pleading as though one sister might shield the others by sheer nearness. But proximity to death is not protection. For only weeks later, Susanna's body was found as well. The circumstances of her death remain both the murkiest and most damning. One June morning, Margaret sent Susanna to fetch water from Hollow Creek itself. She carried the family's tin pail, trudging down the slope toward the creek bed where the water ran shallow but swift. Hours passed and she did not return. Samuel went first. He found the pail in the mud, tipped as though dropped mid-stride. Neighbors were summoned once more. Lanterns combed the banks. They found nothing until the following evening, when a fisherman downstream discovered Susanna's dress caught between rocks. Her small body lay twisted on the riverbed, pale arms, outstretched, her face obscured by silt and reeds. The flow had battered her long enough to wear deep bruises into her skin. Hollow Creek did not weep. They nodded. Lightning, water, fire, stone, river, they tallied aloud. To them it was symmetry, each element claiming its offering, each death another proof that 7 coffins were inevitable. Samuel roared in the church at her funeral, accusing the congregation itself. His voice cracked in rage. It is not God that kills them. It is your hatred. Every whisper, every curse you've slung, you put rocks in their path, flames at their feet. But his fury brought no defense. The congregation sat in stony silence. Perhaps they were ashamed, perhaps only glad the prophecy marched on. 5 graves now lined the churchyard. Eliza, Catherine, Mary, Ruth, Susanna. Each stone stood in a crooked row, the words etched shallow but permanent. And with every burial, the rhyme grew heavier. The Whitlocks were no longer merely a family under suspicion. They were walking scripture. Their daughters were currency in a contract Hollow Creek believed it had with heaven or hell. And soon only 2 remained. Deborah, 12, solemn and brooding. Hannah, 10, pale and tremulous. 2 sisters, 2 graves waiting. The question now was less about survival than sequence. Who would the curse take next? Which coffin would be carried? Across the grass? For a community that once prided itself on neighbors binding together against hardship, Hollow Creek had crafted a cruel compromise. Better that daughters die in one house than misfortune spread among all. Better to mark 7 graves than soil 20. And so Ruth and Susanna's deaths, 2 stones, 1 spring, were not treated as catastrophe. They were treated as inevitability drawing toward conclusion. The Whitlocks went home from that funeral broken, their farmhouse echoing with silence. Samuel took to drinking hard, spending evenings with his shotgun leaned against the table. Margaret whispered prayers, clutching rosaries until her fingers bruised. Deborah and Hannah slept clutching each other, waking at every creak in the boards, and outside, Hollow Creek exhaled as though debts were half paid already. 5 daughters buried, 2 still above ground. The rhyme had almost finished itself. By midsummer of 1872, Hollow Creek carried the reek of prophecy fulfilled halfway. 5 daughters buried. 2 remained. The townspeople spoke of it openly now, not even whispering, shaking their heads over mugs of beer, muttering on porches, nodding in the church pews. It will finish itself, they said. 7 born, 7 gone. The Whitlock household had become a fortress of mourning and fear. Samuel rarely left the property, keeping a shotgun against each doorway. Margaret moved like a ghost through her own kitchen, muttering prayers that her lips scarcely had strength to form. Every sound in the house carried too loudly. Boots on, floorboards, a cough between walls, the kettle shrieking like a soul in torment, and the 2 remaining daughters lived in a silence barely natural for children. 12-year-old Deborah, dark-eyed and stern, had aged into a woman's grief long before womanhood. 10-year-old Hannah remained pale, small, clinging to her sister with desperate loyalty. Neither laughed anymore. They scarcely even spoke, communicating, in glances, huddling close in their narrow bed at night, as if proximity alone could armor them against the world's cruelty. The town watched them with growing impatience. Why stretch it out? They asked. Better the earth takes them, and be done with it. Farmers cited their own bad harvests and spoke of the Whitlock girls as if they were leeches drawing life from everyone else. Reverend Blackwell's sermons grew darker, blurring into prophecy. He thundered from the pulpit about Abraham and Isaac, about sacrifices demanded for the greater good. His words fell on ears already convinced. Then came the summer fever. Hollow Creek fell under the sway of a sickness that July. Children coughing weakly in their beds, mothers bleaching linens, grave diggers busy with more work than they had stomachs for. And though several children fell ill, it was little Hannah Whitlock whose cough echoed loudest in the minds of the town. She took sick swiftly, her breath rattling in her chest as her small body burned with fever. Margaret cradled her, desperate and frantic. forcing cool cloths against Hannah's brow, whispering frantic prayers that God must have wearied of by now. Deborah, watching her sister fading, grew steel around her sorrow. She kept vigil without sleeping, feeding Hannah broth when Samuel insisted, praying when Margaret collapsed in exhaustion. Neighbors walked past the house, muttering that perhaps the curse had chosen a merciful route at last. Fever would take. Hannah and only Deborah would remain to close the circle, but fate, or perhaps cruelty, had other plans. By August, Hannah's fever broke. The child seemed to revive, her cheeks pale but her eyes brightening. Margaret wept in relief, clasping rosary beads so hard they cracked. Samuel, gruff but trembling, dared to believe the end might yet be forestalled. But Deborah, sharp-eyed and too keen for comfort, saw in the neighbors' expressions that survival was not mercy. For Hollow Creek, one more death was not enough. It had to be all. The prophecy demanded both graves, and so it was Deborah who vanished first. It was said she had gone into town for cloth, though it was unusual for a Whitlock girl to walk alone. Hours later, her basket was found abandoned near the churchyard, tipped into the grass as if snatched from her hand. The following morning, her body was recovered in the woods beyond town, lying beneath the twisted roots of an old cypress. Her neck bore bruises, though the coroner insisted they were merely marks from falling branches. Samuel raged, Margaret fainted, but the town said only 6. If Hollow Creek had once been guilty in secret, Deborah's death broke any pretense of innocence. No longer could they whisper of accident or of bad luck. Too many coincidences collapse under their own weight. Some townsfolk shuddered at the thought of murder disguised as prophecy. Others said nothing, content to let the final tally approach. And so Hannah, the youngest, the only child left, became less a daughter than a walking omen. Neighbors crossed the street rather than pass her in town. Children whispered cruel songs when she dared appear. A girl of only 10, and yet entire families recoiled as if she carried plague in her breath. Her presence alone seemed unbearable. Margaret begged Samuel to take her away, begged to flee Hollow Creek before prophecy finished consuming them. His answer was jagged. How could he run when debts chained him to land no one would buy, when half the valley circled like vultures, waiting for death to close the ledger? That autumn, the town buried Hannah as well. She was discovered one October dawn by a farmer on his way to the mill road. Her small frame was slumped against the fence at the Whitlock boundary, hands folded, eyes closed as if asleep. At first, the farmer thought she still breathed, but when he shook her shoulder, the child slumped sideways like a rag doll. The coroner wrote, "Sudden wasting illness." But the people of Hollow Creek said nothing of disease. They nodded gravely, almost satisfied. 7 daughters, 7 graves. The final funeral was cruel in its quietness. The church pews filled, but few wept. Margaret's cries echoed into rafters that gave nothing back. Samuel did not speak. He only stared forward, fists white, as though he had burned hollow behind his eyes. And when the grave was tamped shut, when the earth lay level as if nothing had ever stirred it, the rhyme itself seemed to die alongside the last child. Hollow Creek did not sing it again. The prophecy was fulfilled. Their superstition, their suspicion, their hatred disguised as piety, had written itself into stone. 7 carved markers, crooked in the earth, standing as ugly monuments to fear and cowardice. The Whitlocks themselves did not last. Margaret faded into sickness, speaking more to shadows than to neighbors before dying within a year. Samuel grew violent, drank himself into ruin, abandoned his farm, and was last seen staggering eastward, muttering at ghosts. The farmhouse rotted, empty. The land swallowed weeds and vines, as though soil itself hungered to erase their memory. And yet, Hollow Creek never escaped. Years later, even as the graves sank and the markers weathered, mothers warned daughters not to linger near the churchyard. Farmers muttered when too many girls were born in one house, and travelers passing through whispered of the 7 graves lined in poor earth, a caution carved against the arrogance of raising daughters in a place too hungry for scapegoats. The Whitlock sisters were never witches. They were never cursed. They were only children in the wrong town, at the wrong time, under the heavy thumb of superstition looking for bodies to justify itself. But history preserves little of compassion. It preserves the rhyme. It preserves 7 stones. And so when people speak of Hollow Creek, they still lean closer, voices dropping low, as the words curl out into the air, inevitable, accusatory. 7 sisters, 7 graves. What do you believe? Was it fate, lightning and water, stone and fever? Or was it humanity, neighbors, blinded by fear, willing prophecy into being until only destruction remained? If this story chills you, if it unsettles what you thought you knew about history, share it with someone who believes every tragedy has a simple explanation. Because here, in Hollow Creek, the truth is more terrifying than fiction. Superstition doesn't just predict death, it manufactures it. Comment below. Do you think the sisters were victims of chance, of a curse, or of their own community's hatred? We love reading your perspectives, especially from those who carry their own family legends of misfortune and myth. Don't let the story of the Whitlocks sink into silence like their farmhouse. It's in the retelling that forgotten history breathes again. And if you crave more tales like this, long-forgotten tragedies, chilling folklore carved into stone, and historical mysteries that blur the line between evil and inevitability, subscribe. Ring the notification bell, so the next time history opens its graves, you'll be here with us to peer inside.